Good afternoon, perhaps good evening, or perhaps even good tomorrow morning. I'm so happy to welcome you all here today for our final installment in Beyond Borders, Beyond Boundaries, a series of talks during this academic year, all on Zoom, with speakers nominated by GRI staff. This series has taken us on a journey through art history, from canonical European painters such as Antoine Watteau to exhibition making of the hostile terrain, which turns migrant life and death into tangible form, to the formation of the non-canonical exhibition with the complexity of its afterlife. Our final talk in the series takes us to A Black Gaze with Tina Campt, who will be in conversation with GRI's LeRonn Brooks, GRI Getty Research Institute. We live via Zoom more in the world than ever, even as this pandemic begins to wane, seeking to acknowledge the power of the visual to bring understanding of the past into our present and future. Today, here in Southern California, it's just 4 o'clock, and I stand on traditional Tongva and Gabrielino lands. You, our audience, are in many countries and time zones, from South Africa to Australia, from Nigeria to Barbados, from Israel to California. I welcome you all. We are taping this program and will post it on YouTube within a week or two. Our speaker today is Tina Campt, Owen F. Walker Professor of Humanities and Modern Culture and Media at Brown University, a feminist theorist of visual culture and contemporary art. She is a foundational researcher in Black European studies, theorizing gender, racial, and diasporic formation in Black communities in Europe. Her books include Other Germans, Black Germans and the Politics of Race, Gender, and Memory in the Third Reich, Image Matters, Archive Photography, and the African Diaspora in Europe, and Listening to Images, published just in 2017. There's a new book due out in just a few months from MIT Press, A Black Gaze, which turned to the way Black contemporary artists are shifting the very nature of our interactions with the visual through their creation and curation of a distinctly Black gaze. And that is what Professor Campt will discuss today. She'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll briefly pop back on screen to invite our interlocutor, LeRonn Brooks, Associate Curator for Modern and Contemporary Collections at the Getty Research Institute and a specialist in African American art, to join for a conversation. I'm eager to hear what they have to say together about this topic and to explore the questions beyond the first, and to explore the questions that for about 20 minutes or so. At any point, you, our audience, can begin adding questions to the chat. And then I'll come back on when the last 15 or 20 minutes of our hour is left to bring the questions of the Q&A or chat, depending on if any of our direct panelists want to also pose questions. And I'll shape those questions for both Tina and LeRonn, Drs. Campt and Brooks. Thank you. And without further ado, I turn this over to Professor Campt, and I invite her onto the screen.
Hello. Thank you so much, Mary, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you as well for the invitation to join you and the wonderful community that you have built here, and this amazing series that you have curated so beautifully. What I'm going to be presenting is kind of a preview of the new book. Focusing on one particular artist that I think instantiates the idea of a Black gaze in really quite striking ways. I'm going to do that not by necessarily reading that chapter, although I will be reading a presentation, but embedding that particular section of the book in some comments and reflections on a wonderful interaction that I had recently with a group of students at Parsons School of Design. So I'm just going to launch into it for about 20 minutes. I recently had the great privilege of giving the commencement address for the graduating class of 2021 in the photography program at the Parsons School of Design. As I am sure that you will agree, they, like so many of the seniors graduating this year, are a group of students who have been challenged like few others. Yet, as I emphasized in my remarks to them, they are a graduating class of artists, specifically photographers, who over the course of the last 14 months have been inundated by the transformative power of their medium. Photography is a powerful medium or powerful media form that, particularly this past year, has shown us who we are and who we aspire to become. It is a medium through which we create and perform identities that have been denied us. Read that first slide, yeah. It is a medium through which we have confronted our past and our present, and through which we seek to fashion a different future. Still and moving images have captured our most desperate moments and have mobilized us into action. And still and moving images have catalyzed and sustained us, created hope, and expressed compassion. On the eve of their transition from students to professional artists, I put to them two questions. What will you do with your mastery of this medium? And what is the role of the artist at a time when still and moving images are our predominant vehicles of change? They are questions that speak to the extraordinary potential of their creative practice, and at the same time, they're questions that speak to the truly transformative power of this medium. Over the past several years, I've written quite a lot about the transformative power of photography. But more recently, I've been writing about the transformative power of contemporary artists. What caused this shift was the fact that I found that through their work, they were able to crystallize important insights into our society and our social order in ways that were often much more powerful than many of the written texts that academics like me so frequently use to analyze our historical and contemporary circumstances. I found that their work was teaching me how to understand complex social and political dynamics of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, social dispossession, disposability, and subjection. But I also found that their work was teaching me different ways of seeing myself, my community, and the possibilities for a different kind of future. And I've been writing about these new ways of seeing as what I call a Black gaze. A muscular young man paired with a partial view of a companion who shares the space seated next to him on a couch. They occupy a tiny front room packed with furnishings, objects, and images that fill the compact space of a home that seems almost too small for its occupants. One man cradles an infant in his oversized hands. The other flashes an oversized wad of cash in an equally oversized hand. A nude, bronze-skinned Brazilian woman lies in the classic repose of a 19th century odalisque. She drapes herself over a salmon-colored concrete set of steps against a backdrop of identically colored walls. Snaking from waist to thigh is a tattoo that guides our gaze past a nascent baby bump and down her long legs to rest on an ankle shackled by a strap and an unmistakable metal box of an electronic monitoring device. An older Black woman in a cherry red suit perches on the arm of one of two massive and clearly overloved couches in Rochester, New York. On the couch to her right sits the matching accessory to her fabulous ensemble, an extravagant red hat befitting a treasured matriarch or dedicated church lady. Seated to her right, and sharing the couch on which she perches, her daughter nods off peacefully beside her. These are a series of artworks from Deana Lawson's Hugo Boss Prize exhibition, Centropy, that are currently on display at the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. As I'm sure many of you will know, Lawson is the first photographer to win the prize in its 25 years of existence, which I think says an awful lot about the importance of photography today, both in the art world as well as more broadly. There are a series of photographs that I originally encountered in her studio almost 2 years ago when I was preparing to write an essay for her upcoming catalog. At the time, I had only made one studio visit prior to visiting Lawson's studio. And to be perfectly honest, I was quite nervous about the fact that the artist would be there watching me and my somewhat curious way of writing. It's a method that Deana herself gave me words for when she invited me to visit, describing it as a studio practice of writing. Rather than writing about artworks, I spend most of my time at exhibitions and galleries sitting with and writing to them. I write to them about the feelings they solicit, the forms of discomfort they evoke, the emotional work they require, and the potentially transformative effects they have when we allow ourselves to inhabit those feelings and responses. And seated cross-legged on the floor is my go-to position for writing to art. Writing to art from the floor of a gallery, or in this case, an artist's studio, minimizes you as a viewer and maximizes the work itself. Looking up at it both breaks up and breaks down some of the traditional dynamics of spectatorship and visual mastery. And when the subject of that art is Black folks, challenging the dynamics of spectatorship and visual mastery is an extremely important intervention. However, before I sat and wrote to Lawson's monumental images, they insisted that I walk with them. They're photographs that beckon us to travel with and alongside them. They cannot be engaged passively. They demand an encounter. And as I stood before them and as I walked and lingered in between and among them, I felt them watching me, taking me in and taking me into the spaces of their homes, through the stairways, hallways, and rooms they inhabited and traversed. They are images that beckon you into their places of work in the club, on the street, or somewhere else altogether. Lawson's photographs draw us into a world of strangers to whom we feel intimately connected. Perhaps it's their scale that makes them register so intensely. This series of images are quite frankly huge. She told me she had been encouraged by legendary LA artist, activist, and founder of the Underground Museum, Noah Davis, to go big, and that his words had inspired her to expand the size of her prints from the typical scale of framed gallery prints to expansive tableaus. In doing so, she transformed the Black subjects captured in their frames into life-size simulacra that force us to meet them as equals. Writing to her images from the floor of her studio, encountering them from the bottom up, seated at their feet, gave me a necessary sense of humility. Humility in relation to Black men and women whose unrelenting gazes ricocheted palpably around the room. While Lawson and I were the only people in the studio, the intensity of their presence made it feel as if we were in the middle of a very crowded space. While Lawson's photographs have been celebrated long before and well beyond the Hugo Boss Prize, it is a body of work that many people, particularly Black folks, have difficulty with. Journalist and cultural critic Jenna Wortham recently described that difficulty in quite eloquent terms in her New York Times profile of Lawson. She wrote about her discomfort seeing, quote, such raw and intimate images of Black people on display not only in public, but within the context of an art world that has historically ignored and undervalued them. In the essay, Wortham describes her worry about how Lawson's images might be interpreted. They are photographs that are unapologetic, both in their stage performances as well as their presentation of unvarnished working class Black people. A full-figured Black woman in a bodysuit and sleeveless mesh top stands in a deserted location. The scene is lit for the camera, yet devoid of all other lighting, save for that of a glowing object in the background. It is a setting so barren it resembles the surface of the moon. In this eerie lunar landscape, she poses in an upside down spread eagle, revealing her wide brown bottom. Grasping her ankles, she moons us while looking straight into the camera. A bare chested black man poses regally, seated on a worn couch, flanked by billowing curtains swept into the room by a night breeze from open windows. The camera focuses our gaze on his gold adornments, bracelets, an amulet, and a crown, tribal regalia he wears with the posture of African royalty. Indiscernible from the viewer in the lower left corner is a couch on which an elderly woman sleeps through the shot. A trio of nude black women, cafe au lait, chocolate, and ebony, splay out in tight formation, embracing each other bosom to back and groin to bottom on a carpeted floor. Posing in full splits, backs curved, chins raised, and looking over their shoulders directly into the camera, their assemblage resounds like the ascending notes of a musical scale. Do, re, mi. Lawson's giant prints meet you eye to eye. To view them is to engage in a face-to-face dialogue and be challenged to withstand the force of their penetrating stares. Eschewing the historically elevating function of portraiture to cast its subjects as superior to others, Lawson's images render her subjects as equals. They are photographs that invert the normal rules of spectatorship and spectacularity. Rather than viewing them, we are viewed by these subjects instead. Rather than scrutinizing them, they scrutinize us, and we are captured in an inscrutable and inscrutably powerful Black gaze. Gaze, practices of looking that constitute a network of relationships. A structure of spectatorship in which viewers engage with art objects in ways that are entangled in the dynamics of power between object and spectator. Quote, the relationship of looking in which the subject is caught up in the dynamics of desire through trajectories of looking and being looked at among other people. The gaze is a weighty term that emerged most forcefully and has been appropriated most widely in the field of cinema studies and in feminist film theory in particular. It is a term most often cited to articulate the structure of visual spectatorship and pleasurable looking, specifically who gets looked at, how, and at whose expense. Commonly understood as a gendered dynamic of spectatorship centered on voyeuristic or narcissistic pleasure in looking, the classic definition of the gaze defined the white male viewer as the bearer of the look and the white woman as an object to be looked at. This widely embraced understanding of the gaze is invoked well beyond discussions of screen culture as a shorthand reference to dominating acts of looking that domesticate and objectify women as well as non-white subjects to serve the pleasures of a white male spectator. While this understanding of the gaze as an oppressive structure of dominance will ring familiar to many of you, I want to consider instead these more nuanced definitions of the gaze that I've referenced in these slides and how they might help us to understand this thing I'm calling a Black gaze. Practices of looking that create relationships, structures of seeing that allow viewers to engage with the power of objects and spectators, looking relationships that capture us in an exchange of desire with other people. The concept of a Black gaze that I'm proposing disrupts the equation of a gaze with structures of domination by refusing to reduce its subjects to objects and refusing to grant mastery or pleasure to a viewer at the expense of another. As a concept that is not limited to understanding spectatorship solely or specifically in relationship to the dynamics of film and film theory, a Black gaze rejects traditional understandings of spectatorship by refusing to allow its subjects to be consumed by its viewers. A Black gaze transforms viewers into witnesses and demands a confrontation. In Lawson's work, it is a confrontation expressed so articulately by Wortham with our discomfort in embracing Black life, imaged so unapologetically on its own terms. When we participate as active witnesses in this confrontation, the Black gaze we encounter creates complex and contradictory forms of intimacy. A nude woman shackled to the surveillance of police, an adult daughter unable to stay awake in a photo, wads of cash that suggest alternative ways of getting by, bared breasts and bottoms displayed in unlikely formations and unlikely places. Lawson's images are not always easy to look at, but effortless viewing is not her intent. Her images bring us into intimate contact with individuals who are frequently overlooked as marginal or insignificant, members of working class or impoverished Black and Brown communities whose struggles are palpable in her images. Unlike the typically passive dynamic between viewers and traditional portraits, these are photos that stage an eye-to-eye reckoning that creates forms of intimacy that are not about pity or identification. Neither voyeuristic nor narcissistic, they stage encounters that require work. We must work to confront our resistance to seeing flawed but beautiful bodies of Black women who refuse to be shamed as they display themselves publicly with dignity and purpose. These images capture women posed in striking geometrical shapes that accentuate the elasticity of their flexible bodies. They are photos that echo the long history of Black women's contortions to sustain families and communities against all odds. Lawson's photographs create equally complex imaginings of Black men. They are men who hold babies and partners with passion and pride. They are men who flaunt cash regardless of its source. They are men who wear the regalia of royalty in impoverished settings that lack any indication of grandeur. Juxtaposing scenes of families gathered casually, assembled in living rooms or on couches after church, with those of nude dancers or fly girls, Lawson's photographs make us work to see what seem like the divergent relations depicted in and across them, not as dissonant, but as utterly connected. Lawson does not designate or anoint her subjects with the status of revered or disposable, redeemed or fallen. She does not label or identify her subjects as one or the other. We view them unnamed and ambiguous, and in doing so, we are forced to embrace them as equals. In the process, Lawson creates intimate yet uncomfortable relationships by twinning the respectable with the profane and celebrating the dialogue between them. The intimacy Lawson's images conjure is a haunting intimacy among strangers. As viewers, we are privy to intimate settings, intimate bodies, and intimate relations between those bodies. Her photographs situate us proximate to subjects we do not know, but whom she brings us excruciatingly close to. Her camera's exactingly sharp focus creates a hyperclarity that reveals pores, blemishes, and the gloriously dappled imperfections of Black skin. We see as well the texture of fabrics, surfaces, and objects. The nap of a rug, the distressed weave of a worn out couch, the fuzz on an old slipper, the texture of a wig or a weave, the sheen of a hat, the weight of a crown. The weft and weave of everyday life permeates Lawson's images. They capture intimate strangers rendered so vivid and so familiar that it's impossible to look away, except perhaps for those schooled to routinely avert their gazes from ordinary Black folks and the quotidian existence they eke out across the diaspora. The Black gaze that emerges in Lawson's work is a gaze that immerses us in a Black sociality that is simultaneously mundane and exquisite. It is a gaze that forces us to examine and confront our responses to the work in ways that transform how we see ourselves and one another. I want to end by returning to where I began with my remarks to the photography class of 21 at Parsons. I ended those remarks by offering Lawson's own words as an inspiration and an invitation to them to think of photographs like she does, quote, as portals that unlock a way to enter another place and another consciousness. I extended this invitation as both an urgent challenge and a formidable kind of dare. Because quite frankly, I believe that what the world needs right now is not necessarily more words. It needs more precise and more complex mirrors through which to see ourselves. It needs portals that unlock other ways of thinking and seeing the world. And for this reason, it needs artists that show us the good, the bad, and the ugly of both the harm we do to one another, as well as the forms of care and beauty we are capable of creating. And as I told the class of 21, right now, we need artists more than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina. And now I'm taking a deep breath, and I've been utterly transfixed by words. And I'm hoping that this is a moment, as everyone takes a deep breath in our audience, that they'll begin to think about the conversation that they would like to engage in as well. And so I encourage them all to start thinking about things to pose in the Q&A. But I get to step off screen to read those messages and to bring LeRonn Brooks back onto screen. So thank you, LeRonn, Tina.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it. And thank you, Tina. I mean, that was really amazing. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being here today. You know, I'd like to start in that class of 2021 and that class of photographers too, you know. And, you know, when you began and the first part of your presentation, you said something that was really, really important to the rest of the presentation, and it really sort of touched me in a way. So, you know, in a way, you asked those students, those photographers, those artists to, you know, what will you do with your craft? Right? How will your craft be useful to not only to yourselves, but to this moment of precarity? And Lawson's work speaks to that precarity. But also, I want to sort of read a part of your introduction that touches on this sort of roadmap. Quote, this growing and increasingly influential cohort of Black artists are choosing to look after, care for, and reclaim an uncomfortable Black visual archive that makes audiences work through and toward new ways of encountering precarity, the precarity of Black life. Their artistic practices mobilize Black precarity as a creative force of affirmation that cannot simply be seen or viewed.
No, go ahead. No, I was breathing.
So in your engagement with Lawson's work, but also, you know, your practice of examining the Black gaze and the complexities of the Black gaze, how do you deal with that precarity? Because it's a person to, right, image relationship. There's a relationship there. There's a complicated relationship there. Can you speak about that?
So those words were some of the most challenging sentences to formulate in my book, I have to say, because what I was trying to do is really name something I was feeling, right? Name something that is my response to a lot of the artwork by Black contemporary artists in this moment. And it is the challenge of being able to use visual culture to respond to a moment of endangerment, right? When visual culture has also been the vehicle of that endangerment. And that's the paradox that I'm trying to address in A Black Gaze, is in this moment when the visual is victimizing us, traumatizing us in many ways. We are having to embrace it and use the double edge of it to do something else, right? And to do something else that moves us beyond trauma, moves us beyond being apoplectic, moves us beyond silence. And to be able to strike that balance and create forms of art and artistic practice, right, that can that can recuperate, right, its power and kind of use it for good, right? Even when that good is difficult, right? And that's what I see as happening in work like Deana Lawson's, is that she's pushing us and prodding us to move beyond our comfort zones and to confront something that we don't want to confront in public, which is why I really needed to quote Jenna Wortham, is because she put it in words. She put it in words things that friends of mine have said is, I'm uncomfortable with this. And isn't that the point, right? It's not about being comfortable, and it's not about taking pleasure. It's about being able to challenge yourself to experience all those things at once. And at the same time, to make good art. And I don't want to forget that. I don't want to forget the fact that what I am saying is that this has become part and parcel of what it means to make good art. It is not didactic, right? It is not, agitprop. It has an aesthetic dimension that is complex and demanding. And so that's what I was asking those students to do, is to actually think about their art as participatory, but not in a didactic way. And to really embrace the capacity that they have in being masters of this craft. I'm going to stop there.
And so the work demands an encounter, to use your word, right? Encounter, right? So there's a way in which that demand also requires to move, I guess, on a spectrum of unapologetic activity.
Right.
Right. So what does it mean to have a practice of apology then?
Wow. It's funny because I'm a person who apologizes easily. I see no harm in copping to the fact that I may have hurt other people unintentionally. I actually see that as an invitation to meet somebody as flawed. And to be able to be both unapologetic and at the same time not insulting, right? That to me is the challenge. That is what an apologetic practice would look like, is yes, I am going to set up an encounter that may be difficult, and I'm going to name that difficulty. And it is not about punishing you. It is about meeting each other in relationship to the flaws and also in relationship to the histories that we bring into that encounter. And that those histories are painful. But I don't necessarily want you to believe that you can feel what I feel. And you don't need to have this encounter, right? There is a bridge, and that bridge is not about identification necessarily.
So the viewer then becomes a witness, to use your words again, right? And so to become a witness to these works of art, or to work that actually displays the qualities, right, the complicated qualities of the Black gaze, what does it mean to actually see Black people rather than look at them, right? Mm-hmm. Subject versus person. What does it mean to see Black people rather than just look at them?
Right. To look at them is to be at a distance. It is to have a partition between us and that spectator. To look at someone, to be able to encounter them, right, is to feel a proximity that might be uncomfortable. And it is a proximity that might involve your complicity or implication in that which differentiates your position in society or in relationship to others. So it is to embrace the fact that this is not an equal playing field, a level playing field, and to take that on, right? And it might be uncomfortable. But in doing that, there's a much more genuine encounter and the possibility of exchange. There's a possibility of true dialogue, as well as a shift in position. I do not think it is possible to accomplish that from a distance or simply by seeing as a passive act of consumption. You have to put skin in the game, right? Yeah. And that skin in the game is not necessarily a wager, right? It's an investment. It's an investment that the work that I do to recognize the difference between me and you and the tangled histories that have allowed me to be better off than you, potentially, right? That investment might return a different kind of interaction, a different possibility of being with one another, understanding one another, creating a different kind of relationship in our society.
Doesn't that witnessing come with a consequence, right? Isn't that the lesson from Baldwin, that witnessing does come with consequence, right? So the viewing of art, right, is a transformative process. But I guess the cost is, I mean, and to your larger point, the cost is you may lose who you were before in accepting the complexity of Black life. And so when we see Lawson's work, there's an economic complexity, there's a material culture complexity, right? That challenges respectability politics. And to accept that proposition that what you're seeing is art from people who exist in the world, who may not come from a material culture or class as you, is to actually maybe change. You know, right. So as a professor who teaches artists, and you know, how do you approach this possibility of change? Do you approach it with care? Oh, how do you approach it? Because I'm sure you approach it with care, but how do you use care as an approach?
Well, there's a kind of generational question there's a generational dimension to this that I have to give credit where credit is due. Because the students that I teach are now far more radical than I am. You know, the students that I teach are abolitionists. They are the people who teach me what radical empathy and care can do. And they are the people who teach me to take chances and to put my own position at risk, right? Because they are the folks who call me to account. And care to me should never be, you know, understood as not as it's not caring for, it is actually caring with, right? That we are mutually responsible for one another. And that the consequence you're talking about, pedagogically, boomerangs, right? It truly does. It truly does boomerang into, I mean, I'll give you an example, into my students asking me, yes, or saying, yes, this is difficult. Yes, we have to work to do this. But why? We're doing that all the time. Why are you making us confront this once again? And my response is to actually sort of say, well, that's a good question, but what is the possibility for transformative understanding when you allow yourself to take that step in a classroom with other people who are not on your side, who are not necessarily all with you? That is a different kind of possibility of bridging gaps that might seem unbridgeable. So again, it is about, you know, yes, it's a gamble. It is a wager. I think it's worth it. That doesn't mean that something is not going to shift on both sides, right? That might be uncomfortable on both sides, but it's uncomfortable now, right? It's uncomfortable now. So, you know, what oh my God, now horribly, now it's like Donald Trump. What do you have to lose? No, that's not what I want to say. I think we need to make that step together.
So, it's what I'm hearing is the methodology for life, right? And so the engagement, the methodology by which we can engage visual art, seeing Black people in all our complexity, is actually an engagement for your students here of how to engage not only art, but the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's part of the power of photography still in moving images right now, is that their democratization has made it a medium that is not reserved for artists. And that I had the extraordinary experience of being in a conversation with Trevor Matheson and Garrett Bradley that was sponsored by MoMA and the Studio Museum. And it was based on a series of workshops that they did on visual storytelling. And it was a digital workshop for several hundred people. And we were having a conversation about the power of sound in visual storytelling. And they screened a number of their amateur productions that they created. And I was both speechless and incredibly moved by the fact that this medium, right, we are all students and we are all teachers through this medium. And that democratization has created different possibilities for a pedagogy that is not only about a teacher-student relationship, right? It is about learning together. It is about that kind of collaborative learning that gets us beyond some of the hierarchies that we take for granted in any pedagogical configuration. And that is the power of marshaling visual culture, right? Beyond a narrative necessarily.
Yeah. And so in your introduction, you also speak about writing two images. And in the chapter on Lawson's work, writing two images. And the image you give in terms of how you walk into spaces, galleries, museums, and you sort of decenter the power by taking over a part of the gallery that you can have on your own, and that's the floor, right? Yep. And in that floor, I believe you say you have a cone of solace. You form a cone of solace around you as you write to the images, not about them, but to them. Can you describe that? Explain that.
Yeah. So one of the things that sitting on the floor does is, on the one hand, it makes other people not take you seriously. And at the same time, it gives you this kind of almost ethnographic viewpoint. Because you're both invisible, because it's sort of like, who is that person on the floor? She must be tired, or she doesn't know anything about art, or, she doesn't know the etiquette of art. So you're dismissed. And in being dismissed, you are left alone. And so that's part of this cone of silence. And at the same time, I am not somebody who is trying to order art in a particular kind of way. I'm trying to listen to it. And famously, I'm trying to listen to what it has to say and what it's soliciting from me. And in order to do that, I need to be, personally, I need to be looking up at it so that I'm not saying, I understand you. Right? So that confrontation can't come for me when I'm writing. That encounter can't come at that level of eye to eye yet, right? That comes when I'm looking at it later. But one of the things that I want to do in the writing is I want to really catalog all the responses that I'm having. And I want to catalog them in a quiet way so that I can actually come back to them. One of the methods that I use is to actually write to an image and then put it away, and then read what I've written and then go back to it, and to think about what are the gaps between those two things, because that is where something is speaking to me that may or may not actually be in the image. And that's something that I can pursue and think about, okay, why was that solicited of me? And so then it becomes a dialogue with that image that is not about accuracy, right? Or veracity, right? It is about responsiveness. And usually I then share it with other people who say, who can feel their way into it, or who can query it in ways that make me elaborate on these other dimensions. And I find that to be an incredibly productive relationship to visual culture and to art in particular, because it has that multifaceted, it has those multiple registers that I'm constantly trying to listen to and speak with.
And this, I think, is our last question, Tina, before the Q&A. But in a world in which images are more democratically spread, right? You mentioned over YouTube, the internet, and so the gallery is one way to interact with the work. How do you think the Black gaze actually works in a world in which people have multiple ways of accessing images of Black people, not just in the gallery?
Right. I mean, that's part of why I think it's important to think about a Black gaze, is because the filters, right, for engaging images have melted in a lot of ways, right? That we are inundated by images that are both, made by institutions, by artists, by professionals, but also made by everyday people, right? And so this inundation is making us learn how to engage them differently. It's making us create our own filters, actually, in order to survive and to be able to, think critically. But part of what I'm trying to do in exploding the notion of a monolithic gaze, right, is to try and give credit to the ways in which artists are making demands of us, and the very sophisticated practices that everyday people are actually having to create in order to be in this world of images that are inundating us.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Deana.
You're very welcome.
Really, really wonderful. Thank you.
It's such an interesting conversation. I hate to interrupt it, but I want to actually bring the audience into this conversation as well. So one of the questions that's come up, Tina, is what about Lawson's subjects? Where are they? Are they invited to openings and events? And how do they have agency in the aesthetic discourse?
Yeah. Yes, they are. She's somebody who truly embraces her subjects, and at the opening for her exhibition, she brought several of her subjects that flew in, and yes, they do see their images. She does engage them. She has a personal relationship with them, even though many of them are strangers. That she will be drawn to a particular visual constellation, and she will strike up conversations and invite people into those to participate in the staging of these images. And so it is collaborative to the extent that it is an invitation that they willingly take up, not always seamlessly. She gets questioned a lot about why me? why this? Who are you? What are you doing with this? What is going to happen to those? But she does have a deep investment in the subjects that she photographs, and the staging of those images. So I think that they have a complicated form of agency if we think about agency not necessarily as control, right, but inclusion in a dialogue of in the production of an image and a piece of art, right? So any artistic subject, right, is participating to some extent. They don't have control necessarily over the final product, right? But at the same time, I think that that Deana is much more solicitous than one would imagine she is, and that there's a really complex form of agency of they cannot be photographed without their permission. And at the same time, it is not a journalistic photograph, it is an artistic photograph.
There are a couple of questions that really want to know the big picture, since this book is not out yet, and perhaps people are quickly going to Amazon and pre-ordering from MIT. And I just want to say that Tina did not ask me to say that. But could you just give a kind of a description of the other artists? I think people have been so moved by this. Who else is in the book? And the what you read this afternoon, are those words in the book? Because people are very eager to be able to return to the power of these words.
Most of those words are in the book, yes. They're in the first chapter. Well, the part of what I'm trying to do in the book is say that a Black gaze is not confined to still images or moving images, and that there are certain kinds of creative practice that I believe move in between the still and the moving image. So I talk about folks who create still moving images. I'm also trying to talk about the extent to which a Black gaze is not the gaze of Black folks. So it is not necessarily, it is not only about Black African American artists. So I talk about the work of Arthur Jafa. I talk about the work of Khalil Joseph. I talk about the movement work of Okwe Opakwasili. I talk about the sculpture and film work of Simone Lee. I talk about the still moving images of Luke Willis Thompson. And I think that is, oh, and I talk about the photography of Daoud Bey. And what I'm trying to do is really, again, think about how artists are challenging us, right, to do a particular kind of effective labor in encountering Black precarity. And it is one that is not about how Black people see. It is something that goes beyond identity and something that goes beyond a single media form. And that I hope, right, is an invitation for others to think with me and use this concept in a way that is, critically enlightening. I mean, that's my aspiration.
I think that in a way, you've just answered a few other lines that I nevertheless want to read to you, because I think it tells you of the intensity of the audience in engaging with you this afternoon. But just let me read these words. Can there be, in addition to the size of the photographs and the frontal gaze of the subjects, other photographic media ways in which this encounter can be demanded, requested, invited?
Yes, I definitely think so. When I describe the work of Daoud Bey, and I'm talking about a film that he made 7 63, I believe. It's the date of the bombing of the church in Birmingham and the murder of those three little girls, and it's a beautiful, beautiful silent film. And one of the things that he does as part of the Birmingham project is he does this film that accompanies a series of portraits. And those are generational portraits of a young child, a contemporary young child who was the same age as one of the girls that died, and a contemporary adult who is the age that that child would have been had they lived. And these are all residents of Birmingham, and they are all photographed in a church. And so there's a kind of juxtaposition um, that is about, and these are not huge photographs either, but there's a kind of juxtaposition between different temporalities, right, and different generations of Black precarity that I'm trying to actually talk about as challenging us to think about what might happen, right? How we are continually positioned in how the terror of that event endures today, and you can see it in the eyes of children who might have lost their lives as well, and still could, in the same kind of bombings that are still occurring. And at the same time, those of their contemporaries, those girls' contemporaries, who are living in a moment where that precarity and that terror is being repeated, right? So again, what we're seeing is not necessarily about the size, right? It is not necessarily about a particular aesthetic construction of the image. It is about the way in which these images demand something of us if we allow ourselves to really embrace um, the ways in which we are implicated both in the fear, right, the terror, the precarity, as well as the impunity, right? The impunity or the distance that one has to create or tries to create from that precarity. So I appreciate the words, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify um, that I'm not talking about a particular kind of aesthetic construction. The other thing that Dawoud Bey does in the complementary film that he makes is he has us moving on a path towards the church. And all we see is what they might have seen if they had been looking up on one side. And what we see on the left side of this diptych are the spaces that these children would have inhabited or that this community did inhabit and still might. And so what we're doing is we're juxtaposing simply a journey, right? Through the streets of Birmingham, through some of the social spaces of Black community that brought these individuals together in the church and extinguished them, right? That was the attempt to extinguish Black life, but it lives on, and it lives on in these images of the people who are still the Black Birmingham community. And so we are positioned within those diptychs, the still one and the moving one, in ways that force us to account for, what is our position? Are we implicated? Are we complicit? Are we terrorized? Or are we trying to get to another place that is not any of the above?
It seems like you're positioning survival as a durational process.
Yes. And I mean, the other thing about it is that it is a cyclical temporality, right? Why are we still talking about, Black people being killed in their places of worship, right? Why are we still, right, encountering the targeting of Black people by white supremacy, right? So yes, it is durational, it is ongoing, And what happens when we confront that and not simply the incidents? We confront the larger structure that continues to make it possible for us to have to confront this again and again and again. I mean, that's one of the powerful
Yeah.
things about those generational diptychs, those that they are, they are telling us, I lived through this, and it still could happen to you right now.
Tools for helping us see the past and the present, right? So art, Dawood's work, as tools for helping us witness, I guess.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think there are a few more questions, but I feel as though those words are really the words we want to bring this hour together to a close with. I have to say that I am personally so moved by the concept of the monumentality of photography, which is almost always about miniaturization, right? And sometimes it's monumental when we think of, landscapes of the 19th century landscapes, but almost otherwise it is about making particularly the interior something that you can hold in your hand. And as you've engaged with us today and engaged with Deana Lawson's practice about insisting on being in the interior in a scale that defies compression, you've really taken us to a place to see the world in a fresh and moving and intimate way, an intimacy that we can't turn away from. And I want to thank Professor Campt for this incredible presentation, and my colleague, LeRonn Brooks, for his deep engagement in thinking about your practice as well, Tina, because now you're also in the story, as is LeRonn. So thank you so much for this. And I don't think I have a way to give you a round of applause. It is perhaps one of the things we most lack on Zoom is the ability to put our hands together. And thank you for helping us see different, see more.
Pleasure. Thank you, LeRonn. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you.